The water remains perfectly still this early Tennessee morning as mist rises like ghosts of yesterday. A man sits on the wooden dock, Keith Urban, the guitar legend whose music once filled arenas across the globe. But today he looks different. His hair falls longer around his shoulders. His gaze carries a weight that wasn't there before. The kind of heaviness that comes only from surviving something that nearly broke you. Strange, he whispers toward the quiet lake, how the years that roar the loudest leave behind the deepest silence. This is the world Keith has built for himself now, a lakeside home where most evenings end in solitude, a recording space with windows facing the water, a guitar leaning against unfinished melodies he cannot bring himself to complete. It should feel like peace, this beautiful refuge. Instead, it stands as a reminder of everything that slipped through his fingers. For 2 decades, Keith Urban lived what seemed like the perfect love story. Then, September 30th, 2025 arrived, and that story came crashing down. Divorce documents, custody arrangements, the eerie quiet of rooms that once echoed with children's voices. Each piece feels like lyrics to a song he never wanted to sing 59 days each year. He says softly, "That's all the time I have with my daughters now." His voice cracks, not dramatically, but in that subtle, devastating way a man's voice breaks when he's trying to hold himself together. Beyond the entertainment headlines about upcoming tours, fresh music, possible new romances, and whispers circulating through Nashville's music scene, there exists a reality far more complicated and painful than any gossip column has captured. Keith Urban isn't simply turning a new page in his life. He's desperately trying to recognize the man staring back at him in the mirror when nobody's watching, but someone is always watching. The first memory that returns isn't of celebrity or instruments or the brilliant burn of concert lighting. It's the smell of dust, red dust rising from the dry earth of Caboolture, swirling through the warm Australian air. In this modest Queensland town where ambitions rarely took root and almost never survived. Here, in a home too humble for the size of his imagination, Keith Lionel Urban first discovered a truth that the universe would prove to him repeatedly throughout his life. Greatness never emerges from comfort. He was 6 years old when his father placed that guitar in his small hands, an inexpensive, sun-bleached instrument purchased with funds the family could barely spare. Yet when Robert Urban handed it to his youngest child, his expression held something sacred. Keith gripped it carefully, like holding something alive, uncertain whether to control it or surrender to it. From that moment forward, the guitar became the only item in their house that remained untouched by dust. His mother, Mary Ann, would position herself near the window each evening, carefully sewing tiny rhinestones onto stage costumes she crafted by hand. She never once complained about her pricked fingers or the countless hours spent hunched over fabric in dim lighting. "A star must shine," she would tell him, "even if he's only performing for 10 people in a room that reeks of cheap beer." He would chuckle, assuming she was joking. Years later, performing before 20,000 screaming fans, he realized she had been deadly serious. But childhood meant more than music. Childhood meant the pain of wanting something far too massive for your hometown to contain. He remembers those talent competitions, the sticky gymnasium floors, the harsh fluorescent lights humming overhead, paper decorations taped crookedly to concrete walls. He remembers how the other children studied him, half amazed, half suspicious, as though he possessed some secret too brilliant for such an ordinary place. He remembers the microphone's weight in his trembling hand, his irregular heartbeat before the first note, and that wild, impossible-to-describe surge that flooded through him the instant his voice touched the air. It felt like arriving home to a place he'd never actually seen. Yet even then, the universe was already testing his resolve. There were evenings when electricity failed and he practiced guitar by flickering candlelight, days when his father, exhausted from endless hours at the repair shop, still drove him to performances across Queensland because dreams don't chase themselves, mate. There were weeks when finances grew tight, when meals became simpler, when Mary Ann mended worn clothing rather than purchasing new, because every spare cent went toward music lessons, guitar strings, travel expenses. Neighbors gossiped about the Urban family, about their stubbornness, their fixation, their foolish conviction that some boy from nowhere could become somebody. But gossip never silenced the music. By 12, Keith had already begun transforming himself into something unusual. He played with an intensity that didn't belong to childhood. His fingers moved with desperation. His eyes burned with the singular focus found only in those attempting to escape something. By 14, he performed in bars alongside men double his age, men who drank excessively, smoked constantly, lived recklessly. Keith observed them closely, studied their methods, absorbed their lessons. Not just the musical techniques, he learned the darker truth hidden behind their exhausted expressions. Music rescues you and destroys you, frequently simultaneously. He couldn't know then how profoundly that truth would carve itself into his future. His parents recognized the approaching storm early. They saw the raw gift, the hunger, the unbreakable determination. They understood Australia couldn't hold him, so they encouraged him, gently initially, then more insistently, toward the world beyond Caboolture. They brought him to television programs like New Faces and Have a Go, dressing him in Marianne's handmade outfits, cheering from backstage as he filled Australian living rooms with a voice still too young to comprehend where it would eventually lead. Then Mark Panch appeared, the mentor who heard something sharp and undeniable in Keith's playing, something unrefined but already powerful. Mark didn't tell Keith he possessed talent. He told him he bore responsibility for that talent. It marked the first time Keith understood that gifts, regardless of their brightness, meant nothing without the determination to protect them. By his late teenage years, Caboolture felt suffocating, too quiet for the fire expanding inside him. So he packed his belongings with little beyond a guitar, some clothes, and the unwavering faith of parents who believed in him fiercely enough to release him. Sydney came next. Nashville would follow later. But the young man who departed home already carried the shape of who he would become, driven, restless, haunted by melodies, even while sleeping, quietly convinced his life would be simultaneously larger and lonelier than anyone around him could fathom. Because every dream demands payment, and Keith Urban was about to begin paying, his Sydney arrived louder, faster, more demanding. A city constructed for people who showed up with nothing except determination and willingness to sacrifice everything. Keith Urban entered it like someone walking into a hurricane, unsure whether it would lift him higher or destroy him completely. In the cramped apartment he rented above a chaotic street, he slept beside his guitar case. Because it remained the only familiar thing in this strange new world, he performed in clubs where smoke hung thick in the air and audiences were half intoxicated before his first chord. Yet somehow they listened. Something in his sound cut through the chaos. Sharp, electric, filled with restless energy, Sydney couldn't quite categorize. He assembled a band, rehearsed until sunrise, composed songs at his kitchen table with cold coffee and blistered fingertips. He discovered what chasing opportunities meant, facing rejection, accepting underpayment, continuing regardless. Nights melted into mornings, weeks stretched into months. The dream didn't become easier, but it crystallized. Sydney taught him something Caboolture never could. Success wasn't about natural ability. It was about refusing to quit, but even refusal has boundaries, and eventually Keith recognized no version of his future remained in Australia. Every sign pointed one direction, the same direction his father's vintage records had pointed decades before Nashville. The word itself felt legendary, like a destination whispered by destiny. So with several $100s, a suitcase, and stubborn faith that he belonged somewhere greater than anywhere he'd known Keith, boarded an airplane that would transform everything. Nashville greeted him with freezing air and complete disinterest. The city didn't care about his identity, his talent show victories, his bar performances, his Sydney struggles. Nashville cared about exactly one thing: prove you deserve to be here. So he did. He played guitar for anyone willing to listen, sometimes for money, frequently for nothing. Session work, side projects, guest spots. He existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A ghost carrying a guitar through studios and practice spaces, waiting for someone to hear the thunder he'd transported across oceans. The Ranch emerged next, a country rock group filled with raw ambition and little else. They worked desperately, like their survival depended on it, because truthfully it did. Their album never achieved commercial triumph, but something more valuable happened. People began discussing the guitarist, the kid with blonde hair and fire in his performance, the one who appeared from nowhere but played like someone with everything to lose. And then Nashville did what Nashville always does. It tested him mercilessly. Days arrived when rent seemed impossible, nights when he questioned whether he'd misinterpreted every signal the universe had sent, moments when isolation felt heavy enough to crush whatever strength remained. He knew his abilities were strong, but in a city overflowing with excellence, strong wasn't valuable currency. Still, he kept appearing, kept playing until his fingers ached. Writing until words blurred together, sending recordings to anyone willing to consider them. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, wasn't entitled. He was relentless. And eventually, relentlessness opened a door. 1999 arrived with his moment, not with celebration, but with the quiet certainty of impossible becoming possible. His American debut album, Keith Urban, released into the world carrying a song that would rewrite his existence, But for the Grace of God. The song climbed charts slowly at first, then suddenly, then unstoppably. Country radio couldn't resist it. Nashville couldn't deny it. America couldn't ignore it. For the first time since leaving Caboolture, Keith Urban wasn't merely surviving. He was ascending from there. Momentum became a tidal wave. Golden Road, Somebody Like You, You'll Think of Me, awards, headlines, sold-out venues, thunderous ovations, standing audiences roaring his name. Magazine features, late-night talk shows, the kind of recognition that doesn't simply change careers, it transforms people. But Keith wasn't transformed. Not yet. He was elevated, carried forward by forces that felt like fate finally acknowledging him. Still, in quiet spaces between performances and recording sessions, he felt something familiar pulling at him, a whisper he'd heard in Caboolture, in Sydney, on that long flight to America. Success always demands something in return, and he'd only begun understanding what it would cost him. Fame never arrives gently. It explodes through your life like a storm. Brilliant, deafening, impossible to ignore. When it came for Keith Urban, it didn't knock politely. It shattered through every barrier, swept him into currents beyond his control, carried him to heights he'd imagined only in childhood fantasies. The world he entered resembled nothing like Caboolture, nothing like Sydney, nothing like those uncertain Nashville years in dive bars. This was a world of exclusive access and private lounges, of camera flashes and red carpets, of strangers who suddenly knew intimate details about him as though they'd grown up together. During those years, Keith's life blurred into something unreal. Somebody Like You exploded across America, transforming him from rising artist to someone whose songs defined entire chapters of people's lives. Couples got engaged to it, families celebrated to it, teenagers blasted it from car windows on endless summer highways. And Keith, some nights, still couldn't believe that voice on the radio belonged to him. Then came Golden Road, Be Here, and cascading hits that felt less like album releases and more like cultural earthquakes. Each record pushed him higher. Each tour pulled him deeper into a world where applause never ended. But the silence afterward grew increasingly heavy. Fame possessed a rhythm. He learned it quickly. Mornings in airports, afternoons in recording studios, nights on stage beneath lights, that magnified every emotion. He stood before thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, hearing his name echoing from mouths he'd never seen, faces he'd never encounter again. They screamed for him, reached toward him, worshipped him. And when he played, when his fingers danced across guitar strings, when his voice shattered open a room, he felt something approaching transcendence, but transcendence always fades. After each show, he returned to hotel rooms smelling of fresh linen and profound loneliness. He sat on beds too large for one person, listening to the quiet hum of air conditioning, wondering why applause that shook arenas couldn't follow him into the night. Sometimes he stared at ceilings and whispered into emptiness, I should feel grateful, I should feel complete. But fame doesn't complete anyone. It only illuminates what was already hollow. Still, he continued forward because the music demanded it. By the mid-2000s, Keith had become a phenomenon, an artist who crossed musical boundaries without losing his identity, a guitarist whose solos felt like conversations, a songwriter whose lyrics carried not just melody, but spirit. He was celebrated as the man propelling country music forward, threading rock, pop, and heartland storytelling into something unmistakably unique. But while the world observed brightness, something darker expanded in shadows. A quiet ache, relentless pressure, restlessness that fame only amplified. And music, the very thing that rescued him as a child, began demanding more than inspiration. It demanded escape. There were nights on tour buses after shows ending in triumph when he reached for something stronger than exhaustion. Something that dulled the noise, something that softened the sharp edges of the world he inhabited. Addiction didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in like shadows at dusk. Quietly, almost gently, until he could no longer distinguish where darkness began or where he ended. People celebrated his success. They didn't see the tear forming in the fabric of his life. They didn't hear the silent arguments he conducted with himself. asking why victory came packaged with so much fear, so much isolation, so much self-doubt. But even amid this unraveling, something extraordinary occurred. Fame brought him love. Her name was Nicole Kidman, a woman whose presence felt like calm after years of chaos, like a song he'd been attempting to write his entire life but never found the right words for. Their connection sparked immediately, intense, almost mythological. Two global icons, two artists who understood the violence and vulnerability of public existence, finding sanctuary in each other. Together they became a symbol, elegance, talent, devotion. A love story people admired, envied, romanticized, and for a while it seemed love might rescue him from the darker chapters. Fame was writing behind closed doors. But love cannot heal what a man refuses to confront. And one night, quiet, unremarkable, devastating, he realized he was losing himself, losing her, losing everything he'd fought for since Caboolture. He reached for help. He chose to step into light again. He chose to fight. Redemption doesn't erase scars, but it teaches a man how to live with them. Keith emerged from that battle with a steadier voice, clearer vision, and deeper understanding of the fragile miracle of being alive. Fans noticed something different in his music, a tenderness, a wisdom that could only have been carved by suffering. But the cost of fame wasn't finished with him. Even as he climbed higher, Grammy after Grammy, tour after tour, collaboration after collaboration, the quiet truth remained. Every dream he'd ever imagined had manifested, and yet somewhere deep beneath the roar of applause, a quieter yearning grew, one that no award, no sold-out show, no global success could satisfy. Tragedy rarely arrives as a single event. It accumulates slowly, like gentle rain that becomes a flood, like a trembling note that eventually shatters the entire chord. And for Keith Urban, tragedy came in layers. The first layer he carried privately, the long shadow of addiction, though he emerged from recovery with clearer thinking and steadier footing. The scars it carved never fully disappeared. There were days, far from cameras and crowds, when he felt that old temptation, that familiar whisper of escape curling around the edges of his consciousness. He didn't surrender again, but he knew the darkness intimately enough to fear it. Addiction isn't a chapter you close, it's a companion you learn to walk beside. But the deeper tragedy didn't emerge from the past, it came from the life he constructed afterward. For nearly 20 years, the world believed Keith and Nicole were unbreakable. They appeared as a portrait of devotion, two artists who connected at their career's peak, who loved intensely, who raised two daughters with laughter and discipline, and a gentleness that surprised even those closest. There were red carpets and hand-holding and anniversary celebrations that generated headlines. There were quiet moments the world never witnessed. Small, tender things Keith held like sacred treasures. Nicole's hand resting on his chest when sleep wouldn't come. The way their daughters whispered secrets to him during long drives. Sunday's shy smile. Faith's loud, fearless laughter. He loved being a father. He loved being a husband. He loved the home they created. But love doesn't always survive the storms life generates. Sometimes the storms are silent. It happened gradually. Schedules expanded. Conversations shortened. Distance grew not in miles, but in the invisible space between two hearts that no longer fit together like they once did. Insiders would later claim there were irreconcilable differences, but differences don't destroy marriages. Silences do. By summer 2025, the couple lived separately. On September 30th, the papers were filed, and just like that, the story the world believed in, the fairy tale, ended. But public endings are gentler than private ones. The custody agreement arrived like a blow he hadn't prepared for. Nicole would serve as primary residential parent. The girls would live with her for 306 days annually. Keith would receive 59 days, alternate weekends, scattered holidays, carefully measured time, 59 days, a number that lodged itself in his chest like a splinter he could never extract. He stared at the document endlessly, not because he disagreed with it. Nicole was a devoted mother, dedicated, stable, present, but because he felt the weight of what he was losing. He knew the industry whispered cruel judgments. He tours excessively. He's constantly traveling. He chose music over family. They didn't know, they didn't see, they didn't understand that fame isn't a choice, it's a current, and sometimes it sweeps a man farther from home than he ever intended. He attempted to hide the pain. He smiled during interviews, thanked fans at concerts, finished the High and Alive tour with the same electrifying energy he'd always delivered, but inside he felt hollowed out, like someone had carved out his center and left only the edges standing. Loneliness doesn't shout. It whispers, it creeps, it sits beside you in beautiful rooms and asks, "Who are you now?" And in Nashville, in the house that suddenly felt larger and quieter than ever before, Keith Urban found himself confronting questions he'd avoided for years. What happens when the applause fades? What happens when the world still loves you, but the place you called home no longer does? What happens when a man who spent his life giving music to millions loses the two voices that mattered most? The rumor mill made everything worse. Whispers began spiraling through Nashville about him and Kelsey Ballerini's studio sessions, quiet dinners, laughing too much at private gatherings. Some claimed he was helping her heal after her own heartbreak. Others suggested something more was blossoming. Keith said nothing, Kelsey said nothing, but silence is fuel, and speculation became wildfire. He didn't request attention. He didn't request gossip. He didn't request the spotlight to turn toward the most vulnerable chapter of his life. But fame is merciless. It never looks away. Behind the headlines, the man himself was unraveling. Was. Not into chaos, but into something softer, sadder, truer. The tragedy wasn't scandal or betrayal or downfall. It was something far more human. The quiet grief of a father missing his children, the aching loss of a marriage he tried to save, the fear of starting over at an age when the world assumes you should have everything figured out. But even in the heaviness, a small ember remained, a part of him that still believed in second chances, in music as salvation, in the possibility that life, even shattered, could be beautiful again. But to reach that ember, he would have to confront the truth he'd avoided his entire career. The truth fame had buried, success had disguised, and heartbreak had finally unearthed. There is a moment in every man's life when the noise finally stops. For Keith Urban, that moment came not on stage, not in a studio, not under spotlights or beside crowds, but alone in the stillness of a room that once held his daughter's laughter. Their drawings remained pinned to the wall. A tiny pink hair tie still lay forgotten beside the couch. A half-finished school project sat on the table where they used to do homework together. He picked it up, ran his fingers over the paper, then carefully returned it, afraid that moving it would erase something he couldn't name. That was the night he realized the truth he'd avoided for most of his life. You can build a world powerful enough to shake continents and still lose the one world that truly matters. Hidden beneath the applause, behind the fame, under the layers of success and survival, was a truth Keith had carried since childhood. He had always been running. Running from Caboolture's smallness, running from Sydney's uncertainty, running from Nashville's indifference, running toward music, toward greatness, toward applause, toward anything that made him feel like he was enough. But running comes with a cost, and the cost was finally standing before him. Silent and undeniable. He realized he'd spent decades mastering how to be heard, yet had never learned how to let himself feel. Music was his translation. Guitar strings were his language. Songs were his confessions. Real conversations, honesty without melody, vulnerability without rhythm. Those were much harder. He could speak to millions, but struggled to speak to the few people who mattered most. That was the hidden truth. It wasn't addiction, it wasn't fame, it wasn't the divorce. It wasn't the rumors or the exhaustion or the relentless pull of the road. It was that deep inside, Keith Urban had never stopped being the boy in Caboolture gripping a guitar because it was easier than gripping his own emotions. Music became his shield, his refuge, his escape, his weapon, his prayer. He poured everything into it, joy, pain, fear, longing, so he wouldn't have to say any of it out loud. And the world loved him for it. But the people closest to him needed more than a melody. They needed a man willing to sit still long enough to be seen. They needed a man willing to stay home. Even when the world demanded he tour, they needed a man who didn't hide behind work, behind perfection, behind the machine of fame. He thought he had more time to learn these things, but time is the cruelest currency. It runs out exactly when you need it most. After the divorce, after the custody ruling, after the speculation about Kelsey began to swirl like a gathering storm, Keith confronted a truth he'd never dared to face. Love is not lost in a single moment. It is lost in the small moments we ignore. The missed dinners, the hurried goodbyes, the phone calls cut short, the promises postponed, the exhaustion disguised as dedication, the belief that tomorrow will always come. He thought success would protect his family. He thought providing was the same as being present. He thought loving deeply was the same as loving well. It wasn't. And now, standing in a quiet house filled with memories more vivid than the present, he felt the truth pierce him. You can be a good man and still fail the people you love. But tragedy does not end a man, it reveals him. In the weeks that followed, Keith stopped running. He began showing up differently, not on stage, not online, but in the quiet places that mattered. He called his daughters every night, not because he had to, but because he finally understood that these small conversations were the real music of his life. He stepped back from the noise, from the swirl of rumors, from the pressure to define his next move. He wrote songs, not for radio, not for charts, not for tours, but because writing was the only way he knew how to stitch himself back together. He kept his circle small. He let silence teach him what sound never had. People speculated, whispers grew, fans wondered. Has he found new love? Is he rebuilding? Is his heart open again? But Keith knew the truth. Before he could love anyone else, before he could even decide what the future looked like, he had to learn how to love the man he had become, the man scarred but sober, broken but healing, alone but not lost, still searching, still hopeful, still writing the song of his life one note at a time. And so here he stands, Keith Urban. Not the superstar, not the headline, not the man the world insists on defining, but simply a human being who has walked through brilliance and brokenness, through applause and absence, through love gained and love lost. The lake is quiet tonight, the air is soft. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bird cries and the sound ripples across the water like a reminder that even solitude has a pulse. He closes his eyes and breathes. For the first time in a long time, it is enough. Life has taken much from him, but it has also left him with something rare, clarity. The understanding that happiness is not found in the roar of a stadium, nor in the weight of awards, nor in the sparkle of fame. It is found in the small, unremarkable moments. A daughter's laugh on the phone, a melody forming in silence, the warm touch of sunrise on a quiet morning. Maybe love will find him again. Maybe it already has. Waiting patiently in the wings of some new beginning, maybe the rumors will fade or intensify or turn into stories no one can predict. But tonight, none of that matters. What matters is this: he is still here, still standing, still writing, still learning how to live a life that is fuller, simpler, softer than the one he chased for decades. Keith Urban once ran from the world to become someone extraordinary. Now he is learning to walk slowly enough to finally become himself, and sometimes that is the greatest comeback of all.